Good to see you all tonight. Thanks for being here as we join together this midweek for Bible study. We're continuing on Wednesday night our survey study of the Old Testament. We have a prime objective, a principal goal in this study, and that is we want to just get an overview, a chronological picture in our minds of all the historical events that happened in the Old Testament. I think that's really valuable. We try to teach that to our kids. I know a lot of the classes, Bible classes, are geared to that. We work on it every week when we have the children's Bible drill class going. And I just think it is so valuable for us to be able to picture all the events in the order in which they happened. You know, I think a lot of times, especially people who are not very diligent about Bible study. I mean, if we went out into the community and questioned people and asked them which came first, you know, we could pose a whole lot of Bible scenarios up, and they wouldn't know. They would have no idea which one came first. So I just do think there's a great value in sort of being able to picture things in the order in which they happen. All right, so let's do a quick mental review. Try to picture this in your mind. Try to close your eyes and see the timeline where we've been so far in our Old Testament survey. Obviously, we started with creation. Adam and Eve, their two sons Cain and Abel. The flood, in the time of Noah, the flood and the ark. Afterwards, the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the people, changing their languages. Then the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, ended up in Egypt, rose to power in Egypt. The whole family went to Egypt because of a famine, stayed there for 400 years. In that time period, after Joseph was dead and they forgot all that he had done, the children of Israel became slaves in Egypt. God sent Moses to deliver them out of Egyptian bondage. They did. They crossed the Red Sea, went to the Mount Sinai, received the law, had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of their lack of faith. Ultimately, Joshua led them into the promised land, and they took possession of the land. They were supposed to completely rid the inhabitants of the land, and they didn't. And those people became a snare to them. And so there were repeated cycles where the children of Israel would become unfaithful to God. He would allow enemies to oppress them. Then when they cried out under their oppression, God would send a deliverer. We call those men judges. Some of the famous judges were men like Gideon, the woman judge Deborah, the judge with long hair, Samson, and so forth and so on. The last of the judges was Samuel. He appointed the first king. The people wanted a king. Remember last week we talked about the people said, give us a king like the nations round about us. It really displeased Samuel, but God said, give them what they want. They'll be sorry for it later. So Samuel anointed Saul as king, who had a really amazingly good start as king, but then he changed, he turned. God said, your dynasty will not endure. Saul was killed in battle, and his son Jonathan. David, the son of Jesse, had already been chosen to be the king. Actually, Saul had been seeking to kill him because he knew that he was lined up to be the new king. But Saul dies, David becomes king. David, a man after God's own heart, had his flaws for sure. We know that for sure. When David died, his son Solomon, famous for having great wisdom. He asked for wisdom. God gave him wisdom. God also gave him great riches and fame. Potentially, I think likely, the richest man who ever lived in the history of time, Solomon. But Solomon had his issues. Remember last week at the end of Solomon's life, he'd married so many foreign wives, and they took his heart away from God. He was not faithful to God in the end because his foreign wives led him into idolatry. After Solomon, so we call that period of time the United Kingdom. And there were only 3 kings over all of Israel. Over the United Kingdom, there were only 3 kings. And our kids often recite them: Saul, David, Solomon. Saul, David, Solomon. Those were the only 3 kings over the United Kingdom, and then the kingdom divided. And that's what we're going to talk about in our lesson tonight, the time of the divided kingdom. If you're looking at your study guide, we're on lesson 7. If you don't have that, don't worry. We'll reference the scriptures here in just as we get started. I got to tell you a little funny story. So I always think of this when mention Saul, David, Solomon. Years ago in one of the children's classes, the teacher had written on the board Solomon. Now, how old were those kids, Cindy? 5-year-olds. And the teacher had written Solomon, Soloman, Solomon. And one of the 5-year-olds walked in and said, all of those vowels are supposed to be O. A 5-year-old who knew how to spell Solomon, but then knew that those vowels weren't right. All those vowels are supposed to be O's. Saul, David, Solomon. All right. So after Solomon, Solomon's son Rehoboam was the one who should have taken over and should have thrived as the king, but he was not very smart in the way he handled things from the get-go. First Kings chapter 11 is where we'll start out. 1 Kings chapter 11, notice the very last verse, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 43. Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. And so that should have been the way that it was. Now there was a potential rival on the scene. A man named Jeroboam. It's always intrigued me that their names were so similar, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Jeroboam had been exiled, or not necessarily forced to exile, but he went voluntarily to Egypt because Solomon was trying to kill him. Solomon saw him as a political rival, and there had already been a prophetic indication that Jeroboam was going to fulfill some kind of kingly role. And Solomon was trying to kill him, pursuing him to kill him. He fled to Egypt. But when he heard that Solomon was dead, look at verse 2. It came to pass when Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who was yet in Egypt, heard of it, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon, and Jeroboam dwelt in Egypt, that they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spake unto Rehoboam, saying, Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter, and we will serve thee. And he said unto them, Depart yet for 3 days, then come again to me. And the people departed. Pretty simple request. And obviously what they're talking about is the burden of taxation. Solomon he was very rich himself, but he'd also undertaken enormous building projects across Israel. And you're going to do that kind of stuff, it takes money. And so he had taxed the people pretty heavily. And so the people come to his son now, the man who is, for all indications, to be king, and says, if you will lighten this load, we will serve you. Seems like a reasonable request. He doesn't give them an immediate answer. He says, come back to me in 3 days, I'll give you an answer. So verse 6, King Rehoboam consulted with the old men that stood before Solomon his father while he yet lived, and said, How do ye advise that I may answer this people? And they spake unto him, saying, If thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and wilt serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. But he forsook the counsel of the old men which they had given him, and consulted with the young men that were grown up with him, and which stood before him. And he said to them, What counsel give ye, that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Make the yoke which thy father did put upon us lighter? And the young men that were grown up with him spake unto him, saying, Thus shalt thou speak to this people that spake unto thee, saying, Thy father made our yoke heavy, but make thou it lighter unto us. Thus shalt thou answer them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's loins. And now whereas my father did lade you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father hath chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the 3rd day as the king had appointed, saying, Come to me again the 3rd day. And the king answered the people roughly, and forsook the old men's counsel, and gave that the old men's council had given him. And so he followed the bad advice of the young men. He forsook the good advice of the older wise men, and that just tore it. That was the end of it. We're not going on. If you look as it keeps on going, verse 16, then all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them. The people answered the king, saying, what portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to thine own house, David. So Israel departed into their tents. But as for the children of Israel which dwelt in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. So there's the split, right? There's the split that happens. Judah, if you ever looked at a map of the way the tribes were divided up, the small tribe of Benjamin, actually their territory was sort of within the boundaries of Judah. So we always just talk about Judah, but typically the boundaries of Benjamin were included with them. They stayed loyal to David's family. We talk about the 10 northern tribes. All the rest of them said, we're not having this. And they named Jeroboam as their king. Initially, Rehoboam was going to go after him, and he assembled his army. If you look there in chapter 12 at verse 21, when Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men, which were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam the son of Solomon. But the word of the Lord came unto Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, Speak unto Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and unto the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the remnant of the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, ye shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his home, for this thing is from me. And they hearkened therefore to the word of the Lord, and returned to depart according to the word of the Lord. And so the split is sealed, and it's going to stand, and there's not going to be any changing that going forward. So that is the instigation of the divided kingdom. And so the kings over the divided kingdom now, we're going to always refer to the south as Judah, because that's the principal tribe. And then we're going to refer to the northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, we're going to refer to that as Israel. We'll know them as Israel going forward, and we'll know the southern kingdom as Judah going forward. Rehoboam's going to remain king over Judah, but there will be a succession of kings over the northern kingdom, beginning with Jeroboam. And the thing that we can say that's pretty amazing, we can say categorically, all the kings of the northern kingdom were bad. They didn't have a good... There wasn't a king of the northern kingdom that you could say, he was a pretty good guy. There wasn't any like that. They were all bad, beginning with Jeroboam. So the question is asked, how did Jeroboam seal the deal? How did he ensure that he could hold power? He saw a potential problem. Keep reading there in chapter 12 at verse 25. Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim and dwelt therein, and went out from thence and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again to their Lord, even to Rehoboam king of Judah, and they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And he set the one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. And he made a house of high places, and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sins of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah. And he offered upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So Jeroboam, not a good guy, not a righteous man, but he had some political savvy about him, and I think he was probably right. I think his interpretation of what would transpire. So the temple now, Solomon's temple is standing in Jerusalem, right? So Solomon built the temple, so it's there now. We're not talking tabernacle anymore. The tabernacle, of course, was a tent that they could take down and move wherever they went. Ultimately, it was replaced. Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, and that's where the people would go to make their sacrifice. But that's in Judah. And if the people from the northern kingdom go to Jerusalem to do their sacrifices, like they should, well, they're going to get down there and they're going to mingle with those people. And they're going to say, yeah, you know, this division between us is not good. Let's get back together again. And he says, when they do that, I'm in trouble. So I'm going to tell them, it's too much trouble for you to go to Jerusalem. It's just too much of a burden. And so I'm going to set up a couple places of worship. Dan was way up north, and Bethel was nearer the southern part of Israel. And isn't it odd that he made golden calves? You know, you got to think back to Aaron making the golden calf at Mount Sinai that was such a torment to the people. He made calves, and the people worshiped those golden calves. And of course, it was the sin of idolatry, and that became the besetting sin of Israel, was idolatry from start to finish. J.D.
Of course, the big problem here in the whole thing is Rehoboam's not consulting God, and then, if I'm not mistaken, Jeroboam, didn't God come to him and tell him that if he would be righteous and listen to him, that he would bless him? So his concerns about all the political stuff, if he would have just listened to God and done what God wanted him to do, I think his kingship would have been pretty.
So he didn't have faith there, because you're right. You know, it had, before he fled to Egypt, it had been indicated that he was going to have a part of the leadership of Israel, and the promise was if he was faithful to God, God would bless him in that. He didn't have that faith in God, and so this is really a sign of his lack of faith when he built these idols. I think exactly right, James. Yeah.
It lasts like David's house.
Yeah.
A baby like David did. But then he got there and it's like thinking like a man and not thinking like listening to God. And he just went off with Egypt.
Exactly.
He's forever compared to being the other kings who compared to him.
Yeah, as you read about all the succeeding kings of Egypt, or kings of Israel, as you read about all the succeeding kings of Israel, they said, and he did evil like unto Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. It's repeated over and over again. They reference Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and the evil that he had led the people to commit. This is kind of an interesting text. I preached a sermon on this years ago. I should dig that out. Jeroboam's religion. Did you notice how he tried to make it similar enough to true religion to not turn the people off? He even had a feast day like the feast of Passover. You know, so how does false religion work? Well, you don't come in and just make it obvious, overtly obvious that you're practicing false religion. You got to sprinkle in a little bit of elements of respectability in your false religion, and Jeroboam was shrewd enough to do that, but he led people into idolatry. Wade?
I've been talking to Katie Beth, and she's been over in Italy, going around and seeing all this art, and these figures and things. She texted me today, and she said, because apparently the group she's with has a lot of Catholics, and she said, I know that they're just sick of me, because every time I'm just making light of all these, images, and she said it's so sickening to me to see all this idolatry, but yet they can't see it at all. Yeah. But she can see it plain as day. And she said the ones that read and study, they can see it, but the ones that don't care anything about it, they don't see it.
Yeah. So our day is not that much different than the old days, is it? Pretty impressive. All right. Boy, there's a lot of interesting history that we're obviously going to have to skip over because we're doing a survey, right? We're going to talk now for the next little bit about just the northern kingdom, and then we'll come back and pick up what's going on in the southern kingdom. We got a divided kingdom now. So we really got two different storylines running parallel to one another. We got what's going on in the north, and we got what's going on in Judah. There are instances of interaction between the kings of Israel and Judah, but we got two distinctly different kingdoms. Our author said that 20 monarchs ruled over the northern kingdom, not one of them any good, but the worst was almost without doubt Ahab. So it started out bad with Jeroboam, and then they were all bad. But the one that stands out in our mind as being just tremendously wicked was King Ahab. And of course, he was made even worse because of his wife Jezebel. It's hard to even imagine a more wicked, awful pair than those two. Look how Ahab is described in chapter 1 Kings 21. 1 Kings 21 verse 25. 1 Kings 21 verse 25. It says, "There was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably in following idols, according to all the things as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel." So I think that's there's a heavenly analysis of who was the worst. There was none like unto Ahab. He was the worst of the worst. They were all bad. And of course, as the text says there, he was stirred up by his horribly evil wife Jezebel. So Ahab and Jezebel, those names just stand out, don't they, in our memory as just terribly, terribly wicked persons. So go back, just step back a couple of chapters. During Ahab's reign is when, God had caused, remember, a tremendous famine, a drought. I mean, it hadn't rained for 3 years. All the water dried up and all the plants were dead. The animals were dying. And that came to pass because Elijah had prayed for that. One of the most famous prophets of the Old Testament, one of the most famous righteous prophets of the Old Testament was the man Elijah. If you want to know how impressive Elijah was, who was with the Lord Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? Moses and Elijah. I would think that there's your recommendation, is Elijah is the greatest of the prophets. Moses, the lawgiver, Elijah is the greatest of the prophets. But Jesus is there, and when Peter says, "We'll build 3 tabernacles," God says, "This is my beloved Son. Hear ye him." In the presence of Moses and Elijah, hear Jesus. Jesus is greater than Moses and Elijah, but Elijah got to rank right up there as the greatest of the prophets. In chapter 18, 1 Kings 18, is where there's that very well-remembered contest on Mount Carmel. Ahab and Jezebel was given over completely to the worship of the idol Baal. And it was on Mount Carmel when Elijah called for a contest. 1 Kings 18, verse 18. Ahab had been trying to find Elijah because he blamed him for this terrible drought that was going on. It came to pass when Ahab, verse 17, chapter 18, verse 17, 1 Kings. It came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said unto him, "Art thou he that troubleth Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, in that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Baal. Now therefore send and gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent unto all the children of Israel, and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel. And Elijah came unto all the people and said, "How long halt ye between 2 opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And the people answered him not a word. That's the famous, I wonder how many sermons have been preached on that. They just wouldn't take a stand. They just, Elijah challenges them. Who's the real God here? Serve the real God. And the people wouldn't even take a stand. They wouldn't say anything. They just stood back. So you remember how the episode goes. Build 2 altars. And we'll put sacrifices on the altars. And we'll call for our gods to rain down fire upon the sacrifices. And you go first. And so the prophets of Baal go first. And it's just, there's just some places in the scripture that you almost have to chuckle. These guys are dancing and hooping and hollering. They're cutting themselves. That was sort of a practice of those occult religions. They're cutting themselves and bleeding, trying to get Baal to answer them. And you got to think that Elijah has a little bit of sense of humor. It's a bad situation, but it is kind of funny. He says, verse 27, it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud, for he is a God. Either he's talking or he's pursuing or he's in a journey. Perhaps he sleepeth and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their manner with knives and lances till the blood gushed out upon them. So they were doing everything to try to get Baal to answer their cries for fire from heaven. Of course, Baal's not a real God. Baal's a dead idol. And then, so now Elijah says, okay, let me have my turn. So he puts the wood and the sacrifices, and then he digs a trench around his altar, and he has them fill it with water, 4 barrels of water. Do it again. 4 more barrels of water. Do it again, 4 more barrels of water. And Elijah calls for fire from God, and God sends fire down, consumes the sacrifice, consumes the altar itself, laps up the water that's in the trench. A very powerful sign of the living God versus the dead idol Baal. The famous contest at Mount Carmel. And then, of course, Elijah prays for rain, and it rains. So, we know that story. We know it well. But as you're trying to picture this chronologically, try to remember that the contest at Mount Carmel with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, that happened in the northern kingdom during the reign of Ahab with his wife Jezebel. That's when that all transpired. Okay? Thoughts or comments here by JD?
I've always thought about that because, of course, right after this, then the people were moved and they participated in, slaughtering all the prophets of Baal. And it always kind of made me think, and maybe I'm just misremembering, but I don't think I am, that, you don't read about any kind of big uprising in the country to suddenly, try to make people be more faithful or anything like that after that. So
they didn't do any better afterwards. They were still idolaters afterwards.
It's kind of like they were on God's side for that moment when they saw it, and then it's almost like after that they just kind of went back to,
Yeah. And of course it's not in our questions here, but we'll have to go quickly here. But you remember the next chapter, Jezebel. So they kill all the prophets of Baal. Elijah oversees the slaughtering of all those prophets of Baal, and Jezebel vows, by this time tomorrow you'll be like one of them. I'm going to kill you. And Elijah flees into the wilderness, and you remember, and he's in such a state of deep depression. And again, we've tried to make the point a lot of times about that. So here Elijah's just won a great victory from God. That's got to be a spiritually high moment. And shortly thereafter, he's in the depths of depression. I mean, that's the way our spiritual lives can be sometimes. And then we talk about, basically God said, get up and get busy, Elijah, and gave him some jobs to do and getting back to work again. But that happens right after this episode on Mount Carmel. Got to go quickly. So what happens? All these bad kings in Israel, they never got, as JD just mentioned, they really never got better. And so God allows them to be carried away. 2 Kings, go into 2 Kings now, 2 Kings 17. 2 Kings 17 verse 5. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th month, Hoshea, the king of Assyria, took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river Gozan in the cities of the Medes. So it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. So the end of the northern kingdom is at this point. They are carried away into captivity by the Assyrians, and they never came back from captivity. As a whole, as a unified nation, they never came back from this captivity. Sometimes you hear them referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they never... Now we will read, later we will read of individuals who were from some of those tribes of the northern kingdom, but they never came back as a whole, as a unified country. And so therefore we sometimes ascribe that title, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. But what the Assyrians did, their typical practice was they would take the native people away from the territory they had conquered, and they would bring other people from other conquered places and put them in there. So right here is the historical note that we read about in our New Testaments. Why did the Jews hate the Samaritans so badly? It was because those Samaritans were people who were transplanted in here when the Assyrians took the northern kingdom away. They brought these people in and transplanted them there, and the Jews always hated them because of it. So there's a great ethnic division between the Jews and the Samaritans, but it relates to this point in Old Testament history. Wayne?
Plus they perverted the religion. The lions came in and started devouring the people. They said, well, how can we get rid of the lions? I got an idea. Let's get one of the
Old priests.
One of the old priests and bring him in and have him teach the religion of the Jews to these transplants.
Yeah.
And so they combined the religion of Judaism with the practice of the land.
Yeah.
And their religion was completely...
You remember when Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well? She said, our fathers worship in this mountain, but you Jews say you have to go to Jerusalem to worship. So they were trying to worship in Mount Gerizim, which was near Samaria. They tried to set up a place of worship, imitating, to some degree, the worship of the Jews. All right. Oh boy, we're going to run out of time rapidly. So Hezekiah, about that same time, Hezekiah becomes king over the southern kingdom. He's a good king. Look in 2 Kings 18, verse 1. Sometimes we ask the kids, name a good king in Judah. Well, Hezekiah stands out as one of the best. Hezekiah, chapter 18, 2 Kings 18, 1. Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. 25 years old was when he began to reign. He reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was also Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father did. He removed the high places, brake the images, cut down the groves, brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it, and he called it Nehushtan, and trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. For he clave to the Lord and departed not from following him, and kept his commandments which the Lord commanded Moses. And the Lord was with him, and he prospered whithersoever he went forth. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria, and served him not. And he smote the Philistines even unto Gaza, and the borders thereof, from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. So Hezekiah stands out as a great king in Judah. It's kind of an interesting little footnote there in verse 4. When he was destroying all the idol worship in Judah, one of the things he destroyed was the brazen serpent which Moses made. You remember the instance when Israel had sinned and God sent fiery serpents in among them and they were biting and killing the people? And God instructed Moses to put a brazen serpent on a pole and stand between the people. And those who looked on the brazen serpent were spared from the fiery serpents. We never read in the historical development of that, we never read what became of that brazen serpent that had stopped the plague of the fiery serpents. But here we find out that they had preserved that, and they had actually begun to make it an element of idolatrous worship. What does Hezekiah do when he realizes that they're worshiping this serpent? What does he do? I can't destroy that. That's sort of an artifact. That's a historical artifact. That's kind of precious. No, he destroys it because they're making it an element of worship. And that's one of the things that he's praised for doing. He was really good. So, I want to skip. During Hezekiah's reign, he has to deal with the Assyrians. Real quickly, turn to chapter 19, verse 32. 1932. Thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria. So Assyria was the big bully on the block. After them is going to come Babylon. But at this time, Assyria is the great world empire. They're the powerful conquering army. And they're still threatening. They've already taken the northern kingdom, and they're threatening the southern kingdom. 2 Kings 19, verse 32, therefore says the Lord concerning the kingdom of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, Jerusalem, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with a shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, shall not come into this city, says the Lord, for I will defend this city, to save it for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. Ends up he gets assassinated when he gets back home. But God delivers Jerusalem from the Assyrians. So Israel's taken by the Assyrians. Judah is not, because God miraculously delivered them in the time of Hezekiah. Another good king in Israel was one of the boy kings we sometimes refer to them as the boy kings of Judah. There was an earlier king who began to reign just as a child, Joash. Then the later boy king of Judah was Josiah. And look in some of the things that developed in the time of Josiah. These are fairly well known. Chapter 22 of Kings, 2 Kings, verse 8. They're restoring the temple. The temple has fallen into disrepair, and under Josiah they're going to repair the temple. Isn't that hard to imagine? Here's this enormous, elaborate temple that Solomon had made so glorious, and they had allowed it to fall into disrepair. But under Josiah, they're going to restore the kingdom. And it says, 2 Kings 22:8, Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan the scribe came to the king, Josiah, and brought the king word again and said, Thy servants have gathered the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of them that do the work and have the oversight of the house of the Lord. And Shaphan the scribe showed the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest hath delivered me a book. And Shaphan read it before the Lord. And it came to pass when the king had read the words of the book of the law that he rent his clothes. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam the son of Shaphan and Achbor the son of Milchiah and Shaphan the scribe and Asahiah, a servant of the king, saying, Go ye, inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for Judah concerning the words of the book that is found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not hearkened to the words of this book to do according to all that was written concerning us. And so they had actually lost the law, and it's found in the dilapidated temple that they're now trying to restore. They find the book of the law, and it doesn't take much reading to say, whoa, we got a big problem here. we haven't been doing what this book says we're supposed to be doing. We're sure the Lord must be angry with us because we've not been keeping His law. And so they do keep Josiah mandates that they do start doing according to the words of the law. Chapter 23, verse 21. Chapter 23, verse 21. The king commanded all the people, saying, keep the Passover unto the Lord your God, as is written in the book of this covenant. Surely there was not holden such a Passover from the days of the judges that judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel, nor the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, wherein this Passover was holden to the Lord in Jerusalem. So Josiah is a good king who puts them back on the right path. Then comes, but the people are not consistently faithful. So that we said in the northern kingdom, all the kings are bad. In the southern kingdom of Judah, some of the kings were good. Hezekiah stands out. Josiah stands out as good kings, but they weren't all good, and there was still it seems hard for us to imagine, but there was just this pursuing temptation of idolatry. They just were so given over to the temptation of idolatry, and it just recurred again and again. And so God is going to allow the southern kingdom to be taken in captivity, and that's where the somewhat famous Babylonian king that we read about so often, Nebuchadnezzar, comes on the scene. So now Assyria has fallen. We said Assyria was the big bully on the block. That empire has disintegrated now, and another has arisen a little farther to the east, Babylon. The Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar's their great king. And Nebuchadnezzar comes and he defeats Jerusalem. Look in 2 Chronicles now. Obviously, so I think we all know this from our Bible study. 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, there's a tremendous amount of overlap, right? Because they're talking, it's the same history. The Chronicles are the Chronicles of the Kings. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 14. Moreover, all the chief of the priests, this is what happens when Babylon takes them. Moreover, of the chief of the priests and the people transgressed very much after all the abominations of the heathen, and polluted the house of the Lord which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And the Lord God their father sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees. The Babylonians are also called the Chaldeans. He brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man, or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon, and they burnt the house of God, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kings of Persia. So, one of the things we try to remember, northern kingdom taken away by the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom endures for most of 150 years longer. But they are ultimately carried away into Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar, the great Babylonian king. But the difference here is going to be, and this is what we'll talk about next week in our lesson, the things that happened during the exile and then the return from the exile. The southern kingdom, Judah, going to be carried away into 70 years of captivity by the Babylonians. But ultimately they will return. And we'll talk about that return next time. Boy, you have to go fast. It's just hard to pass over so many great instances and points of interest. But again, we're trying to get this picture in our mind, this chronological overview of the Old Testament. And so tonight our lesson was about the divided kingdoms and then what happened to both? They both ended up being taken away into captivity. Assyria took the northern kingdom. They never returned. Babylon took Judah, the southern kingdom. They will return after a period of 70 years captivity. All right, thanks everybody.